Greetings, I, all praising King Selassie, Rastafari. On this day, we recognize the resurrection of our Lord, Yeshua, the Messiah. For in Luke chapter 24, verse 7, the Christ is delivered into the hands of sinners on the first day, crucified on the second day, and risen on the third day. Now, in chapter 14 of Mark, the lawyers and those high priests, Pharisees, sought to take the Christ by craft and put to death. Yet they feared a public outcry if it were to be done on that day, for the people had begun to prepare for the feast of unleavened bread. And in the same chapter, in verse 12, it is stated, the disciples went to the Christ on the first day of unleavened bread and asked, "Where will you that we go and prepare that you may eat the Passover?" As we recall in Exodus chapter 12, verse 8, the children had feasted on the night of the first day of the Passover, signaling a new day, for the beginning of the day is upon sundown. And as Lord smote the firstborn of Egypt, the children feasted, because the Passover being held on the 14th day of the first month, this day of unleavened bread is on the 15th day of the first month. Also, in Matthew 26:17, it is stated, the first of the unleavened bread, when the disciples came and asked, as the Christ directed them to go into the city and look for the man bearing the pitcher of water that will show you the place where the feast will occur. This is sometimes referred to as the Last Supper. It is really the first supper, because it is where the Christ invites all of mankind for all future generations, those that thirst and hunger, to come and drink and eat of the bread and wine of righteousness. Righteousness. And so, as declared in Matthew 26:20, it was on the evening of the first day of the Passover, the beginning of the second day, the 15th day of the first month, that the Feast of Unleavened Bread occurred in that room. In the book of Luke, chapter 22, gives another account of the time being of that day, having the Feast of Unleavened Bread drawing near. And in the 7th verse of the same chapter, the feast then came. Now, the day is also considered the preparation for Sabbath. In Luke 23:54, as the Christ had been crucified during the 6th through the 9th hour, it was the day of the preparation of the Sabbath. Even those followers, having prepared and resting on the Sabbath day, in Luke 23:56. And so this day of unleavened bread is the day of preparation, the following day being the Sabbath. As we recall, the Sabbath is the 7th day, a day of rest, a day of respect for Yahweh. And so even the Jews knew the body was not to remain on the cross during this day. In John 19:31, because it was the preparation that the body should not remain on the Sabbath day. And so I can acknowledge that the Christ being crucified during the 6th and the 9th hour on the cross, as declared in Mark 15:33, as well as Matthew 27:45 and Luke 23:44. There was darkness throughout the land, giving a change to the day upon the sundown. So therefore, the Christ, having hung on the day of unleavened bread at the 3rd hour, because he was brought in the morning in Mark 15 before Pilate, the judge. And between that time and the time that his body ceased, the sun came down. Therefore, it was on the Sabbath day that the Christ had been crucified. And same as the scribes and Pharisees sought not to charge him on the day of the feast, they did in fact just that. And so, defying their own law, and then it is stated in Luke chapter 24 that it was the first of the week, early in the morning, when the people came to the tomb. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and other women, to find the Christ had risen. So therefore, if the Feast of Unleavened Bread falls on the 15th, and the next day being the Sabbath, in which Christ's followers rested, it was the following morning on the day of the Sabbath that Christ had risen. And so, on our calendar, if we are to start the day of unleavened bread on the eve of the 14th, then 3 days shall be on the 17th. And this is the day we acknowledge the resurrection of Lord first, to acknowledge the Passover. And then, 3 days after, shall we celebrate not necessarily on Sunday, this day that the man calls Easter. I finish by the word of the Christ in Luke 23:46. Abba, into your hands do I commend thy spirit. In John 19:30, it is finished.